When I stepped out of the pool, water traced slow, glistening lines down my skin, vanishing into the fabric of my swimsuit. The sun was blazing, the air thick with heat, but I barely noticed. My attention was elsewhere, on him. Damon was sitting on the terrace, book in hand. But he wasn't reading. He was watching me. It was quick, too quick, like he didn't want me to notice. But I did. The way his eyes locked onto me for that extra second, the way his fingers tensed around the pages, the way his jaw clenched ever so slightly before he forced himself to turn back to his book. It wasn't the look of a stepfather admiring his stepdaughter. It was something else. Damon was 45, my mother's husband for the past 3 years. Always disciplined, always in control. He never lost his temper, never showed cracks in his composure. A man who commanded attention without even trying. He had the kind of presence that made people sit up, listen, obey. I'd seen him negotiate million-dollar deals over the phone without so much as raising his voice. And yet, for the first time, I saw hesitation. I could have walked away, acted like I didn't notice. That was the smart thing to do. The safe thing to do. But I didn't want to. Hot day, huh? My voice was light, casual, but inside, my pulse quickened. Damon didn't look up. Yeah. I picked up my towel, but instead of wrapping it around myself, I let it hang loosely in my hands. The sun was drying me fast, each slow droplet making its way down my collarbone, over my stomach, disappearing against my skin. You look tense, I said, tilting my head slightly. His fingers tightened around his book. Just a lot on my mind. I smiled. He was uncomfortable. Good. How long could he hold out? Dinner that night should have been normal. My mother was talking about some new project at work, her voice animated as she gestured between bites of pasta. Damon listened, nodding in all the right places, his posture perfectly relaxed. To anyone else, it would seem like a perfectly ordinary evening. But I knew better. Because he hadn't looked at me once. It was deliberate. Forced. And that told me everything. I decided to test it. I leaned forward, reaching for my drink slowly, letting my fingers graze the rim of the glass with deliberate ease. Nothing. I crossed my legs under the table, shifting slightly so that my bare knee brushed against his. Still nothing. But that silence, that deliberate avoidance, was worse than if he had reacted. Because normal men don't try this hard to act normal. I almost laughed. This was going to be fun. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. I should have been tired, but my mind was racing. I replayed that split second by the pool, the way his control faltered. Was I imagining it? Had I wanted to see something that wasn't there? No. I knew what I saw. And I knew this was just the beginning. The house was silent, the kind of silence that only comes when everyone else is deep in sleep. I slipped out of bed, my feet making no sound against the cold floor. I didn't know why I was moving, why I was heading toward the staircase. Maybe I was testing a theory. Maybe I just wanted to see. At the bottom of the stairs, a faint glow spilled from the kitchen. Someone was awake. I moved quietly, pausing just outside the doorway. Damon stood by the counter, pouring himself a drink. He was alone, the dim light casting sharp shadows across his face. His jaw was tense, his shoulders stiff. He exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. And for the first time, he looked unsettled. Like something was bothering him. Like something was eating at him. I stepped forward, just enough for him to notice. Couldn't sleep? Damon stiffened instantly, the muscles in his back going rigid. He turned slowly, his eyes flicking to mine for a fraction of a second before he looked away. You should be in bed, he muttered, taking a sip of his drink. So should you. He let out a slow breath through his nose, shaking his head. Lily, go back upstairs. Not kiddo. Not the casual, fatherly way he usually said my name. Just Lily. I took a step closer. Are you okay? I asked, keeping my voice soft. His jaw tensed again. I'm fine. Liar. I tilted my head, watching him. You don't seem fine. Damon's fingers tightened around his glass. Lily. Did I do something? I cut him off, taking another step forward. Earlier? By the pool? His entire posture stiffened. Bingo. His grip on the glass was so tight I thought it might shatter. His lips parted slightly, like he wanted to say something, but he didn't. You've been acting weird since this afternoon, I continued. Did I do something to make you uncomfortable? His fingers twitched. That was all the confirmation I needed. I smiled. Because for the first time, he wasn't in control. I should have stopped. I should have walked away, gone back upstairs, ended this game before it even began. But I didn't want to. Because now, I knew I had power. And I wanted to see what happened if I used it. Damon was strong, disciplined, a fortress of control. But even fortresses had cracks. And I had just found one. I wanted to see how deep it went. And something told me I wasn't going to stop until I found out. The next morning, I walked into the kitchen in my shortest pair of shorts and a thin tank top. The air conditioning had kept my skin cool, but the moment I stepped into the warmth of the sunlit room, I felt the heat settle over me. Damon was already there, standing by the counter with a steaming cup of coffee in his hands. He looked up as I entered, his gaze flickering over me for a split second before he returned his attention to his drink. "Good morning," I said, my tone light, casual. I walked past him to the fridge, bending slightly as I reached for a cold bottle of water. I took my time, pretending to scan the shelves, feeling the weight of his presence behind me. I felt his gaze. Even if he was trying to be discreet, I knew he was watching. "Sleep well?" His voice was even, controlled, but there was a tightness to it, something that hadn't been there before. I smiled as I twisted the cap off my bottle. "Very well. And you?" "Yeah," he answered quickly, too quickly. I raised the bottle to my lips, taking a slow sip, letting a single drop of water escape, trailing down my lip. I licked it away absently, as if I wasn't aware of what I was doing. But I saw it, the slight shift in his posture, the way his fingers tightened around the coffee mug just a little too hard. And then he turned away. The game had begun. For the rest of the day, we moved around each other like two strangers sharing the same space. Conversations were kept short, interactions brief. If I walked into a room, Damon would find a reason to leave. If we passed each other in the hallway, he kept his eyes forward, never lingering, never acknowledging me longer than necessary. But avoidance was acknowledgement. If there was truly nothing there, he wouldn't have to try so hard. I tested it throughout the day, standing a little closer when we spoke, letting my fingers trail against the kitchen counter as I walked past him. I watched for the smallest reactions, the way his jaw clenched, the way he took slightly deeper breaths when I was near. He was fighting it. And he was losing. By evening, the tension had thickened into something almost tangible. My mother was working late, leaving just the two of us in the house. I was in my room, the door cracked open, pretending to read, but my attention was on the quiet of the house. Then I heard it. Footsteps in the hallway. Slow. Hesitant. Then silence. I knew he was there. He wasn't moving. Wasn't knocking. He was just standing there. Waiting. I felt my pulse quicken, an electric charge running through me. He was right outside my door. He could have kept walking, gone back to his room, ignored whatever had been building between us since that moment by the pool. But he didn't. I stood up, walked to the door, and opened it. Damon was there, just as I expected. His face was unreadable, but his breathing was controlled, measured, like he was deliberately keeping himself in check. His eyes met mine, and for a brief second, something flickered there, something restrained, something unspoken. I didn't ask why he was there. I didn't need to. I already knew the answer. The silence stretched between us, thick with everything neither of us was saying. I tilted my head slightly, watching him. "Did you need something?" My voice was soft, but there was an edge to it, a quiet challenge. His jaw tensed. "You left your light on." A lie. A weak one. I glanced over my shoulder at my lamp, still glowing softly beside my bed. I could have let him have that excuse, let him turn and walk away with whatever dignity he was clinging to. But I didn't. Instead, I stepped back slightly, leaving the doorway open. "Do you want to come in?" His breath caught, barely noticeable, but I caught it. For the first time since this started, he was the one being tested. He could walk away. He could shut the door on this before it spiraled into something neither of us could control. But he didn't move. And in that hesitation, I had my answer. I smiled. This wasn't over. Not even close. The next day, he no longer avoided me. Something had changed. I could feel it in the way he moved, the way his eyes lingered just a second longer than they should have. He wasn't ignoring me anymore. He wasn't forcing himself to look away when I walked into the room. He was watching, observing, calculating. At breakfast, he sat across from me, his coffee untouched. My mother was talking about something, some client, some event, but I barely registered her words. I was too focused on the fact that Damon's eyes weren't on his phone, or his plate, or even on her. They were on me. He wasn't hiding it anymore. He was testing me, seeing if I would acknowledge what had happened last night, if I would look at him the same way I had when I stood in his doorway, daring him to break first. I took a sip of my juice, licking a stray drop from my lips. His fingers curled slightly against the table. "May, are you listening?" My mother's voice pulled me back. I blinked, forcing a neutral expression. "Yeah. You were saying something about Friday?" She sighed, shaking her head. "You need to start paying attention. Anyway, I might be home late that night. It depends on how the meeting goes." I nodded, as if I cared. But all I could think about was the fact that Damon had just shifted in his seat, clearing his throat, suddenly very interested in his coffee. That night, I couldn't sleep. My body was restless, my mind circling the same thought over and over. His words from last night echoed in my head. "If you don't leave now, I won't stop next time." He had meant it. I had seen it in his face, heard it in his voice. It wasn't a bluff, wasn't some weak attempt to scare me off. It was a warning. A real one. And I hadn't listened. I slipped out of bed, my heart already racing even though I hadn't done anything yet. The hallway was dark, the house silent. I didn't hesitate this time. I walked straight to his door, lifted my hand, and knocked once. Silence. I knocked again. Nothing. I turned the handle and pushed the door open. He was there, exactly as I had imagined, sitting in the chair by the window, a glass of whiskey in his hand. His posture was relaxed, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his grip tightened slightly around the glass as I stepped inside. He didn't look at me right away. "This is wrong, May," he said, his voice low, tired, rougher than usual. "But you're still here," I replied. I closed the door behind me, leaning against it for a moment before taking a step forward. His jaw clenched, but he didn't move. I took another step, closing the space between us. "You should go," he said, his voice controlled, but there was something beneath it. Something breaking. I reached out, just the slightest movement, my fingers brushing against his shoulder. The second I touched him, his entire body went rigid. He inhaled sharply, his grip on the whiskey glass tightening. Then, in a blur of motion, he stood up so fast that the chair nearly tipped over. "Go to bed," he ordered. I didn't. The air between us was thick, charged, suffocating. I had never felt anything like it before. Every inch of me was aware of him, of the heat radiating from his skin, of the way his breathing had changed, just the slightest bit heavier, the slightest bit uneven. "You don't really want me to leave," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. His jaw tightened. "Don't push me, May." I placed my hand flat against his chest, feeling the steady hammering of his heart beneath my palm. His fingers twitched at his sides, like he wanted to grab me, to push me away, to do anything other than stand there and let this happen. "Tell me to stop," I challenged. He didn't. Instead, his hand shot out, grabbing my wrist, not roughly, but firmly, holding me in place. His grip was warm, steady, but I could feel the restraint in it, the careful calculation of strength. He wasn't holding me back. He was holding himself back. "If you don't leave now, I won't stop next time," he warned. Something inside me twisted, something dark and thrilling and terrifying all at once. Because I knew what he meant. And he was right. I should have been scared. I wasn't. His eyes locked onto mine, intense, unreadable. For a second, neither of us moved. Then, as if something snapped inside him, he let go of my wrist and took a sharp step back, putting distance between us. He turned away, running a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "This isn't a game," he muttered. I smiled. "It feels like one." His head snapped back toward me, his eyes dark, dangerous. "That's because you don't understand the rules yet." He walked past me, reaching for the door. For a second, I thought he was going to push me out. But instead, he stopped right beside me, so close I could feel the heat of his body, the slow, controlled rise and fall of his breathing. Then, without looking at me, he spoke again, his voice lower this time, almost too quiet to hear. "Go to bed, May." This time, I listened. But as I walked away, I knew one thing for sure. I had already won. Mom decided that we needed a vacation. It was supposed to be a chance to relax, to escape the routine, to spend time together as a family. But I knew this trip would be something else. It would force us to be closer. It would force him to see me every day, in swimsuits, in light summer dresses, with wet hair dripping down my back after swimming. It would force him to fight himself all over again. We left for a week-long stay in a small seaside town. White sand, turquoise water, little cafes along the boardwalk, and the scent of salt in the air, everything was picture perfect. Mom was thrilled about finally taking time off work, talking endlessly about all the sightseeing and local cuisine she wanted to try. I nodded, pretending to listen, but my mind was elsewhere. Damon had been quiet since we arrived. He was trying too hard to act normal, to maintain his usual detached calm. But I saw through it. I noticed how his fingers tapped absently against the table during meals, how he barely touched his wine at dinner, how he avoided being alone with me unless it was unavoidable. He thought distance would help him stay in control. He was wrong. The first 2 days passed in a carefully orchestrated dance. Mom dragged us to tourist spots, beaches, restaurants, making sure we were all together. But the evenings were different. The air was thick with humidity and something else, unspoken tension. On the 3rd day, I decided to test him. I wore the smallest bikini I had, the one that made men stare. It wasn't meant for swimming, it was meant for attention. And it worked. Damon was already at the pool when I arrived. He had a book in his hands, sunglasses shielding his eyes. Mom was still getting ready in the hotel room, so for the first time, it was just the two of us. I walked slowly, giving him time to notice me, and then slipped into the water with an effortless dive. I surfaced, wiping the water from my face, and swam toward the edge, where he sat. He hadn't turned a page. He hadn't moved. "Why aren't you swimming?" I asked, tilting my head. He exhaled slowly. "I'm fine here." I smirked. "Afraid to get wet?" His grip on the book tightened. "May." Just my name. A warning. I leaned my arms on the pool's edge, water glistening on my skin under the afternoon sun. "You're staring." He finally looked at me, and even behind the sunglasses, I could feel the weight of his gaze. "You should go back inside." I ran a hand through my wet hair, watching the muscles in his jaw tighten. "Why? You don't like having me here?" Silence. Then, suddenly, he stood. "I'll be inside." I watched him walk away. He wasn't fine. That night at dinner, he barely spoke. The next evening, Mom wanted to explore the night market along the boardwalk. After dinner, she insisted on stopping at a small shop filled with souvenirs, her excitement keeping her distracted. "I'm tired," I said suddenly, stretching my arms as if exhausted. "I think I'll head back to the hotel." "Are you sure?" she asked, flipping through postcards. Damon was standing beside her, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. "Yeah," I nodded, glancing at him. "You don't mind walking me back, do you?" His shoulders tensed just slightly before he answered. "Of course." The hotel was only a short walk away, but every step felt deliberate. The night air was warm, the streets dimly lit. Neither of us spoke until we reached the room. I stepped inside first, leaving the door open behind me. He hesitated. "You should go to bed," he said, finally stepping inside, but not closing the door. I turned to face him. "You don't really want me to, do you?" His jaw clenched. "Nay." I stepped closer. "Say it." "Say what?" I looked up at him, my voice barely above a whisper. "That you don't want me." His breath hitched. His hands curled into fists at his sides. The silence between us stretched unbearably, charged, dangerous. Then he exhaled sharply and turned away. "We're not doing this," he said, voice strained. I reached out, my fingers brushing against his arm, and he flinched, but he didn't pull away. "You've already lost," I whispered. And that was when we heard it, the sound of keys turning in the lock. Damon jerked back, stepping away from me just as Mom walked into the room. She looked between us, her expression neutral. "Everything okay?" I nodded quickly. "Yeah, we were just talking." Damon grabbed a bottle of water from the table, his hand steady, his face unreadable. "I was just leaving." Mom didn't question it. She started talking about the market, oblivious to the way my heart was hammering in my chest. Damon walked out without another word. I watched him go, knowing this wasn't over. Because next time, he wouldn't stop. The morning was quiet. Too quiet. Mom was packing for her excursion, talking about landmarks and sightseeing, completely unaware of the tension in the room. Damon stood near the window, arms crossed, staring at the ocean. He hadn't spoken much since last night. He didn't need to. We both knew what today meant. There were no distractions, no one watching, no excuses left. I'll be back late, Mom said, zipping her bag shut. Don't wait up for me. I nodded. Have fun. Damon said nothing. The door closed behind her. The silence was suffocating. He stayed by the window, gripping the ledge like he needed to hold on to something. Like he was waiting for me to walk away. But I didn't. I stepped closer, my voice soft. You knew this would happen. His fingers tightened around the wood. May. You knew. I reached out, letting my fingertips graze his arm. His body tensed, but he didn't move away. I took another step, closing the space between us, feeling the heat radiating off him. His breathing was slow, controlled, but I could hear the hesitation breaking. You don't have to fight it anymore. His jaw clenched. This is wrong. But you don't want me to stop. He exhaled, sharp and uneven. My hand slid down his arm, slow, deliberate. His pulse was racing. I stepped even closer, my body nearly pressing against his. His hands twitched at his sides like he wanted to grab me but was still fighting it. And then he wasn't. His fingers found my waist, firm, hesitant for only a second before pulling me in. My skin burned where he touched me, heat spreading from that single point of contact. His other hand trailed down my back, careful but desperate. There was no space left between us. His breathing changed. So did mine. His touch was slow, reverent, like he was memorizing every inch. My hands gripped his shoulders, grounding myself, feeling him surrender. He was shaking. Or maybe I was. The air felt heavier, charged, like we were standing at the edge of something we could never come back from. I felt his hesitation. But I also felt him break. And then there was no stopping. It happened. Between us. It was inevitable. It had always been inevitable. And neither of us could take it back. The room was still spinning when I heard it. The sound of keys turning in the lock. Damon froze. I barely had time to process before the door swung open. Mom stood in the doorway. The silence that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced. No shouting. No crying. Just silence. Her eyes moved between us, taking in everything, the tangled sheets, the discarded clothes, the undeniable truth. Damon was the first to move. He grabbed for his shirt, his hands shaking. She didn't look at him. She looked at me. And in that moment, I knew. Everything was over. Her voice was calm. Too calm. Get out. Damon hesitated, but only for a second. Then he nodded, grabbed his things, and walked past her without a word. I didn't watch him leave. I couldn't. Mom turned back to me, her expression unreadable. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. She didn't wait for me to speak. She just walked away. And that was the worst part. Not the anger. Not the disappointment. Just leaving me there. Damon was gone. And I thought I had one. But I had lost everything. And the worst part? I had no one to blame but myself.